Everybody, welcome back to another episode of Critical Perspectives. Multiple times we've had amazing discussions about a multitude of subjects, and we wanted to bring them on to further discuss the UNSC vote and the abstention of Russia and China and the crater, the gigantic just crater that's created essentially because there have been, of course, subsequent arguments about whether or not many of us are hyper-focusing on this, that we should be, especially people like us who are Westerners or who have, grown up in the United States or the UK or Europe and have zero reason to be going after China or Russia, which have been long seen as, if not anti-imperialist sectors by many people on the left, as at least reliable allies and partners. And so I think it's vital to discuss it further because we're not the only ones that really, as we had spoken on our other show, were constructively critical. And also we had been talking about a lot of these things leading up to this moment. We have been some of the few people pointing out the lack of just focus on the reality of how China and Russia are operating economically, pragmatically, and the geopolitics of that versus, say, just cheerleading and just looking at it from one way, which is, just the only way, or, just the other end of the spectrum, which is completely, full of lies and trying to vilify both China and Russia. So there hasn't really been much nuance. And I think all of us here kind of love to dive into the issue of nuance. So let's go ahead and get started because I want to hear from all of you. First of all, Vanessa, I'd like to hear from you since you're my co-host about, what has happened since this abstention, right? What has happened since the abstention, because the abstention didn't matter. The veto wouldn't have mattered, according to many people, because China, Israel, and the United States wouldn't have respected anything, anyway. But yes, that's the point. They wouldn't have respected anything, and they haven't. They've continued attacking not just Palestine and Palestinians in Gaza, but specifically refugee camps, specifically innocent people, also in Lebanon. Can you tell us about that? And then let's just go from there. Welcome, everyone.
Yeah, it's really good to be on with you guys and be really interesting to get your views. I have to say that one of the best articles written on the entire subject is published up at BettBeat Media, and I recommend that everybody goes and reads that. It's absolutely a seminal article that I think encapsulates everything that we're living through at the moment, generally as humanity. What I'm really hating to see in the discourse, especially on social media, although of course we know that social media has been created for exactly this, to divide and create an environment in which people can't have nuanced discussions or even have debates that are pretty heated, but are still heading at least in the same destination of fighting back against the wholesale cruelty that we're seeing in the world today. And of course, again, that scenario is also being created as a psychological war against us as human beings, as those that represent the dispensable of the world today, let's call it that way. So I think for me, one of the worst things that I saw coming out was, this is all an Arab problem. This isn't our problem. And therefore, why should Russia or China get involved in this? One, I don't think that's representative. At least I certainly hope that isn't representative of Russian and Chinese populations. What it's representative of is an inbuilt Orientalism and racism towards the people of this region, whether it's this region, of course, or whether it's areas of Africa also that are being targeted at the moment, like Sudan. But I think the first thing that I want to say is I don't really understand why there was no veto. Because is the sky going to fall on Russia and China's head if they had vetoed this resolution? And it's kind of nonsense to say that if they had vetoed it, the violence would have increased. Because the violence is going to increase anyway, as we've seen since the resolution was passed. There were a number of strikes in Lebanon. First of all, against a playing field in a Palestinian refugee camp, and Israel Katz made it very clear that he no longer considers the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon to be humanitarian centers. He considers them to be hotbeds of Hamas and therefore legitimate targets for Israel. So immediately we saw an escalation of the targeting of Palestinians, not only in Gaza and in the West Bank, but also in Lebanon itself. Yesterday, there were 4 missiles, precision strike missiles. An assassination was carried out in the suburbs of Beirut, in Dakheh, in an incredibly busy kind of market area in those suburbs. 27 people injured, most of them horrifically. Some had even been previously injured in the pager attacks, now injured again. And 5 killed, including, of course, a prominent Hezbollah leader and a number of his comrades. So I'm struggling to understand the rationale that is being put out there, and I don't see much variation in the rationale either. In my opinion, it's almost dismissive of what is happening in Palestine, sadly. And as I said, is this representative of China and Russia and the populations in those countries? I'm really not convinced of that, even if they are commentators from the region, whether it's Vietnam or China itself. So I guess I could say a lot more, and we'll get more into what were the reasons perhaps behind the abstention. But I'd like to hear from you guys first, maybe Peter first, as to, what your impression is, both of what happened, maybe the reasons behind it, in your opinion. And for me, the potential awful ramifications of this lack of veto, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think my best guess as to the fundamental reason for the lack of a veto and an abstention instead is fundamentally it comes down to China's foreign policy philosophy. Their foreign policy philosophy over many years has been essentially to support other governments in other parts of the world when they are in accord with Chinese foreign policy goals, but never to sort of impose their will in the way that the U.S. routinely imposes its will around the world. So basically, I think that had there been a critical mass of governments in the region who are willing to pay the pretty substantial cost of bucking the U.S. government's desires on this question, I think it's very likely they would have vetoed. But without a local partner, it's basically it goes against the entire foreign policy philosophy that they've been implementing for decades now. And that's why I really just wasn't surprised at this. To be honest, I was quite busy over the past couple of weeks, so I wasn't really following this closely, and I haven't read much of the sort of reactions and takes on this. But I really wasn't surprised, simply because there would need to be, it seems to me, something quite... Basically, you'd have to see a revolution in China's foreign policy philosophy in order for them to veto in this instance. Now, that's entirely a separate issue of should they have vetoed. That's a separate question. I'm just giving you my best explanation. And then secondarily, and I think this is much more speculative, I'm very confident about the aspect about the traditional foreign policy philosophy that China has long implemented. The second bit, which is a little more speculative, is perhaps the Russian government might have wanted China to abstain from vetoing, or just to abstain, simply not to rock the boat when they're right in the middle of negotiations over the Ukraine war with the US. I say I'm not so confident about that because it seems like there are a lot of other potential avenues that could have been done. You know, the Russians could have told the US, hey, look, we abstained. We tried to tell the Chinese to abstain too, but you know, we can't tell them what to do. We still want to play ball with you on the Ukraine war negotiations. So, like I said, that part is much more speculative, but I think it's entirely in the realm of possibility that because China values its relationship with the Russian government so much that they would be willing to do that anyway. But I'm just saying that's not a necessary or sufficient explanation, because the foreign policy philosophy explanation is necessary and sufficient. And so the other speculative one really just is that, speculative.
Karim?
Yeah, I guess I hear an echo. But I guess in that case, in that sense, I may agree with you, Peter. If you try to unpack the rationale, and that's a very difficult thing. But what I am able to do is at least to dissect what it means. I won't be able to say why China did this. I find it too hard to do. But at least to a certain extent, I can say what it means. And Fiorella, you said something very good. You said we are constructively critical. I really like that, the way you stated that, because it's true. We come from a place of respect. We don't like these channels that are only Russia bashing or China bashing. But on the other hand, we also are not like the channels that only go praise, hallelujah, everything that comes from Russia or China is fantastic, or the BRICS. And I think in this case, we need to very critically evaluate what's going on and what does this mean? Because what we often learn in many anti-imperialist outlets, channels, whether it's Substack, YouTube channels, you name it, we often hear from a lot of very good commentators, by the way, that we are dealing with an anti-imperialist bloc, the rise of the BRICS nations, the global South. They are a counterpole in a multipolar world to US imperialism. And when we dissect what just happened at the UN, we really have to question if this is a form of anti-imperialism. Then I think we may actually, some of these people may actually see it wrongly, because we recently had a conversation with a man called Professor Patrick Bond from South Africa. And he actually says that many, or if not most, of the BRICS nations are simply sub-imperialist. And when you see what happened with the UN vote by abstaining, it is actually China and Russia gave, you could say, a stamp of approval to the killers and the rapists of Gaza to actually just take over and deal with the population there. We're also talking about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of orphans. We're talking about the Epstein class taking over of these people. Let's not forget that. But often people don't connect these dots. But I think this is a very, very disgusting thing that is happening here. And when you say, for example, when you have a policy as China, for example, you say, okay, we have a hands-off approach. We let the regional players decide primarily, and we go along with that. Then you have a serious problem if most of the regional players are client states of US imperialism. In other words, Your foreign policy is pro-imperialist because you hand out the final decision, to imperial vassals. So in that case, you cannot call a country like China or Russia anti-imperialist, because if you would be anti-imperialist, you would stop the core of imperialism, Israel and the United States, from taking over a very important part of the world, that is Palestine. Now, there's many other ideas that pop up into my mind, but that is what first comes into my mind.
I quickly want to respond to some of what Peter say, because I'm not in total agreement. I mean, I agree with you that China and Russia, both philosophically, they do very much rely on, one, the UN Charter, and following the, you know, international law diplomatically. This is what they always say. Now, in terms of their non-veto, okay, the thing is, that is like what they have said. That is what they have stated, that they didn't want to go against the Arab states that actually wanted to pass through this peace resolution. We have heard numerous statements from several Chinese officials. You're right in terms of how they've portrayed themselves. Their rhetoric, they always abide by international law. They always are about sovereignty, non-interference. The reality is that they do interfere depending on the situation. And it's not necessarily in like the diplomatic sense when we see, for example, the UNSC, but it is more in the sense of deals and back channel deals and sort of these transactions that are happening. The United States and the Chinese economy are entirely intertwined. Everybody in the world actually is in one way or another dependent on China. They have made themselves extremely, it's well done, really, like economically. They have gathered created a powerhouse in terms of economic, just self-sufficiency, economic power. And that is very well known. I mean, anybody can talk to you, whether they're in Russia or the United States. And in both places, actually, I've found that certain people feel a little bit antagonistic towards China because they feel threatened by the might of its economic power. But when China says that they relied on respecting the sovereignty of the Arab nations, of the Palestinian Authority, I know that they're smarter than that, and I know that they know that Saudi Arabia, Qatar, that all of these countries that have betrayed the Palestinians, that haven't absolutely done anything, are controlled vassals of the United States and Israel. So if they know this, and if they know that the Palestinian Authority has no authority, then I see it as a cop-out to say that that's why they did it, because these established states are saying that they support this. We know that these states do not have the support of, say, Hamas, because Hamas did not support the resolution. Hamas was not in favor, neither was the resistance. Now, of course, they can say, well, we don't consider them, the actual government, because they're just factions. They're not the ruling government. But again, like, if there is an ideological, fundamental drive in China, a supposed communist country, a supposed communist powerhouse, then I'm not seeing it. I am not seeing that ideological side, because that ideological side would be resistance minded. This is why Venezuela is in danger, because Venezuela has a resistance-like spirit. This is why Cuba has constantly been under attack. Nicaragua, several key sectors, and you can point out even North Korea in some ways how they operate. But when it comes to China, the way I have seen their decisions and their diplomacy, it has been very much like Russia, just extremely pragmatic, hyper-focused on expanding its economic interests. Yes, definitely diplomatic. Yes, definitely going in with, like, hey, let's have a win-win situation. Let's have a mutually beneficial deal, but we're also going to benefit. And I've seen this in Latin America. I've seen this in Africa. This is why the anti-imperialist left in Latin America has constantly thought well of China, because they're building, for example, they're building bridges, they're building trains, they're trying to say, let's build something, whereas the US just goes in and takes it. But that doesn't mean that they're not benefiting from it. That doesn't mean that there isn't a monetary incentive. And I'm not saying that it's bad, that it's, I'm not going to be, like on a pedestal and say, oh, that's, you can't make any monetary gain from it. But I do think they get sort of, a lot of things get not, like, they don't ever get any sort of criticism for this, Vanessa mentioned Sudan, but they're also deeply embedded, and I can talk about this a little bit later, like with a lot of the major U.S. corporations in the United States. I mean, it's become kind of comical when China's economy isn't just intertwined. I mean, we're talking about a billionaire type of economy. We're talking about large investment firms like Vanguard and BlackRock that are basically shareholders in many Chinese corporations, and that wealth, I think, it really shows that the economy and the economic desires of these nations far outweigh the ideological demands that they have. So that's just something I wanted to point out.
Yeah, and sorry, go on, Peter.
No, go ahead.
No, I mean, I just also wanted to add, I think, yes, that's how China and Russia, represent themselves as adhering to international law, not stepping outside the frame of international law, etc. But that doesn't sit easily with me when you consider that China, I'll get on to Russia in a second, but China recognized the state of Palestine based on 67 borders in 1988. It then went on to recognize the state of Israel in 1992, having failed to do so previously because of the Cold War alignments between the West and Israel. So China is perfectly well aware of how Israel is aligned with Western powers. And of course, as Fee said, the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, to a large degree, were effectively created by the British or engineered by the British to have a sort of a pool of Wahhabi terrorists in Saudi Arabia that could be unleashed against any countries that wouldn't come into line with British Zionist US policy in the region, including, of course, threats against Jordan and Egypt over the years. And of course, we've seen them unleashed in Syria and in Iraq to weaken sovereign nations, particularly Syria very recently. So my guess would be that China is fully aware of all of this history. But in my opinion, for both countries, their trade in the region is number one reliant upon Israel, but then reliant upon the entire Zionist bloc, which of course are the Arab countries that they're referring to that voted pro the resolution because they're part of that Zionist British US created and adopted complex. And when you look at after the normalization with Israel in 92 or the recognition of the state of Israel by China, we saw China become Israel's number one trade partner from Asia. And that hasn't really changed. They haven't throttled back. In fact, in the last 3 or 4 days, there have been reports about them, 3 Chinese state companies investing in Israeli energy supply through kind of backdoor method. So they're investing or partnering actual Israeli companies to enable their expansion into Israeli infrastructure and economic industry and trade in the occupied territories of Palestine. At the same time, of course, they're expanding and increasing their trade partnerships with the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. So that is their foothold in the region. And what I find quite interesting is the contextual events leading up to the abstention. So number one, from Russia's perspective, there was a phone call between Putin and Netanyahu. Almost immediately, I think 3-4 days before the abstention. Almost immediately, there was a Russian military delegation that arrived in Damascus and did a military tour of the south. 24 hours after that, Netanyahu entered southern Syria and addressed his troops there on the basis of not only reinforcing their positions of occupation, but expanding. And since that event, and of course now everyone is claiming there's a rift between Moscow and Israel, which in my opinion is nonsense, because Russia has historically worked with Israel in the region. They have what is known as a balanced friendship. Even when Russia came in to defend Syria, particularly against ISIS in 2015, they still very much worked on a partnership basis with Israel. And originally, the Russian bases, after the fall of, or rather the liberation of Dara in the south, Russia basically put positions and bases in the south in agreement with Israel to prevent resistance factions reaching the border with the occupied Golan territories. So that's number one from that perspective. But what I also find really interesting, China up until very recently had basically not been recognizing the Jolani al-Qaeda government in Syria until suddenly Jolani came back from his meeting with Trump. Again, this is all around the time of the abstention. It's speculative, but I'm just putting it into context because I find it extremely interesting that all these events were kind of swirling around at the same time. And then with Russia, of course, we have to look at what's going on in Ukraine and the fact that the so-called secret peace deal was also announced almost immediately after the abstention. But if we look at what happened with China, I found this very odd also. So Jolani came back from the meeting at the White House. Within 24 hours, Assad al-Shaibani, the former al-Qaeda founder in Syria, had been dispatched to China. So China, up until now, is not recognizing the Syrian Takfiri regime, nor should they. But suddenly, Shaibani is in China. China is talking economic investment in Syria again, which gives them a foothold back in the country, and also did a deal with Jolani over sending back the Uyghur terrorists, because that was the number one reason that China was not happy to normalize relations with Jolani, was because of the number of Uyghur terrorists that were under his command, right? So suddenly that happened as well. So I can't rule that out as being part of some, because we know what the US does. Whenever there's a major vote going through the UN Security Council, they're putting pressure on people. The fact that Algeria voted for is incredibly disappointing for me, because Algeria has been, I mean, Karim nodding there, Algeria has been one of the number one supporters of Palestinian sovereignty. But what I also find interesting is, from Russia's perspective, they're actually been at times reliant upon the Gulf states. In 2016, there was a fiscal shortfall of 2 trillion rubles. And it was Qatar that stepped in and bailed them out with a 10 billion loan offset against 19% shares in Rosneft oil complex, right? They're dependent on Saudi Arabia. They're dependent on UAE, deals with the UAE. All these three countries have poured billions into Russia, particularly into the Kazan region, which was where the latest BRICS summit was held for very good reason. So when China has recognized the state of Palestine and appears to uphold the sovereignty of Palestine and is calling for a two-state solution based on the 67 borders, which I disagree with anyway. But nevertheless, they then went against their own belief in Palestinian sovereignty, because there's nothing in the Trump plan that talks about a Palestinian state. Until the Palestinians have basically disarmed, given up their territory, given up any kind of resistance, given up any kind of belief in justice or reparations. Right. So from this perspective, I'm struggling to understand what international law means to both these countries, because you can't make statements upholding Palestinian sovereignty and right to statehood and justice and an end to occupation of their territories, and then abstain on a resolution which offers them nothing in acknowledgement of their rights, or even in any kind of assurances of their rights in the near future.
Wow, there's a lot of really good points in both of what you said. I'm gonna actually, I think this kind of offers me the opportunity to stop biting my tongue and say in a public forum what I have bit my tongue about for I don't know, 4 years now, because I thought it would not be helpful in any way and perhaps counterproductive. But I think in this context, perhaps it might not be counterproductive and might even be helpful. We, as Homo sapiens, as humanity, are so deeply... Hold on. Do you use taboo words like curse words on your program, or shall I use a...
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, we are so deeply fucked right now. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist has the midnight clock, doomsday clock, closest to midnight that it's ever been. Half of that reason is because nuclear holocaust is closer than it's ever been, primarily because the US and Russia are no longer as closely cooperating on nuclear issues as they were in the past. And of course, the war in Ukraine increases the risk, particularly when you have idiots in the US establishment talking about, oh, you know, Russia would never use nukes. That would be irrational. And because it's irrational, we don't have to worry about it. Because as we know, states always make perfectly rational decisions and mistakes never happen. That's half of the reason. The other half of the reason is the ecological crisis, which, you know, is sometimes a little distant for us to really wrap our heads around. Climate change is the most commonly known part of the broader crisis, but it comprises a number of different aspects that are all directly tied to our system of economic production that's destroying the life support of the capacity of the planet, and will result not, you know, we don't have to worry about the polar bears dying immediately or, you know, sea level rise. That's down the road. That's what natural scientists focus on. Social scientists, when they look at the likely effects of the ecological catastrophe that we are running straight head into, point out that the real worry is a massive increase in wars. Because what happens when droughts become worse, heat waves become worse, food production goes down, mass migrations happen because desperate people are trying to flee certain death, and they'll take on a risk of potential death somewhere else. That causes political conflict. It's very easy to imagine a massive increase in the number of wars occurring around the world as the ecological crisis intensifies, gets worse. You can actually look to the Department of Defense for some pretty good research on this, because this is within their remit as the imperial masters of the universe. And they've actually done excellent analysis that this is what we're heading into. Right now, the situation that we see around the world now, as horrible as it is like a fucking appetizer to what we should expect is just down the road, because we're not doing what's essential. And what's essential is a page one rewrite of the entire global economic system. The only way that happens is if we have an unprecedented degree of international cooperation between, at minimum, China, the US, and the EU. If you had those three polities cooperating closely on completely rewriting the global economic system, then we have a chance of avoiding the worst outcomes of the ecological crisis, which again is not the ice caps melting and sea level rise and storms. That's bad enough. But we're talking about the human impacts. You know, for instance, there are a number of analyses on the Syrian civil war pointing out that it was climate change that created the ground conditions for people to rise up and join the anti-government movement. That's just what we expect all over the world. So that's the baseline situation that we're in. Very little hope. We're heading towards absolute disaster, and the kinds of changes we need to see are not visible right now. We've moved away from what's needed since 2020, when we in the US lost the primary election that could potentially have been a start of moving in the right direction, although a massive uphill battle even had we won that election in the general election. But leaving that aside, the baseline condition that we're all in is horrendous. So I bring this up because it seems to me that making the correct moral judgment about the rectitude of the Chinese government is a bit beside the point. It's a bit of, you know, critiquing the people rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. There is a matter of truth, and, you know, fair enough if you want to just like find the true moral judgment, and you're talking to people who have a unduly rosy, the Hosanna chorus, the Hallelujah chorus that Karim talks about. Absolutely. Yeah, that does make some sense. But right now, I'm just thinking about, practically speaking, what do we need? We need to get people in the US and European countries to capture state power. And that means educating a whole hell of a lot of people who are currently dangerously ignorant into understanding the situation that we're in, and furthermore, understanding what's required, which is a great degree of organization and discipline, which is something that the Western left has proven horrendously bad at. So getting back to like the question of, is the traditional foreign policy philosophy of the Chinese government a cop-out? I think that's an entirely plausible hypothesis. I mean, certainly if you were in the position of a Chinese government official, you might think, well, what's really the point here? There are deals to be made. We can strengthen our economic power. But I think that argument would be much more convincing if there were actual evidence of the Chinese government engaging in a foreign policy different from its current, and not just current, but decades running philosophy. I am not aware of any such instance. And because of that, I don't think it's probably accurate to call it a cop-out in the sense that they have one belief, but they're not following that belief because they see a monetary benefit. A great example is the Naxalite rebellion in India. Right across the border, you have a Maoist revolutionary group. Literally, they are self-identifying Maoists that the Chinese government stopped supporting decades upon decades upon decades ago. And they're not supporting them to this day. Meanwhile, the Indian government is massacring people, not just the Naxalites, not just the Maoists, but plenty of what they call tribals, villagers who are not in the dominant social economic form of organization in India. So it just seems to me like that's the more likely what's actually going on, as disappointing or unsatisfying of an explanation as that is. When it comes to trade with Israel for China, I mean, 14 billion for China is a rounding error. Like if you look, the Financial Times did a really good graphic about this a couple of years ago. They showed the year 2000, the entire global map. All countries in blue were countries that had the US as its primary trading partner. All countries were painted red if China was their main trading partner. 2000, the world is blue. 2005, the world starts to be a little bit red. Vietnam, etc. Countries in the region start to turn red. 2010, half the world's red. 2015, 3/4 is red. 2020, most of the world is red. So most of the world has China as the most significant trading partner. 14 bill is just not that big. So I really just have a hard time understanding how protecting trade with Israel would really be a main concern. A potential other concern would be the fact that, all of us talk about how, which one is the dog wagging the tail and which one is, or is it the tail wagging the dog? But all of us understand that implicitly there's one dog. It's a dog, one dog, the US Israel. It's a unity. And I think it's entirely imaginable that the Chinese foreign policy officials would be looking at this as, this is not an independent country, Israel, we're dealing with. We're dealing with a 51st state. So starting an aggressive or confrontational approach with Israel is the same thing as doing that with the U.S. And I guess I'll just leave off with, Mao Zedong decades ago, I forget who he was talking to, somebody in Palestine said something like, the imperialists have Taiwan for us in the East, and for you in the West of Asia, they have Israel. But it's the same basic thing. That's the tip of the spear that they're attempting to use to eventually destroy us. And I just think like that's probably the best explanation, leaving aside moral judgment. That can be this way or that. But for people like us who are citizens of Western countries, I just think the most important thing is to keep our eyes on the ball and to refuse to fall into the trap that a lot of Western leftists fell into during the last Cold War, where they might have had perfectly reasonable moral critiques of the USSR. I mean, God knows there were plenty perfectly reasonable moral critiques to be made of the USSR's policies. But the CIA saw that as, mwah, love it, mwah. That's a great opportunity. We can now defang these leftists, and even this tiny little group in Western countries, we don't have to worry about them opposing our policies on the USSR, because now they believe that they're just evil too. So neither Washington nor Moscow. And that is the thing that really kind of makes me a little uncomfortable. In addition, this is the last point, all of us can empathize with this. I'm sure we've all heard at some point in our lives as Western leftists, some right-wing idiot telling us, oh my God, why are you protesting like Israel? Don't you know that in Iran, the human rights situation is so bad? Or like, why are you protesting women's rights in the US? Like, you should be protesting women's rights in Iran. And it's like, okay, that's idiotic for two reasons. One, intent. Your intent, you don't give a shit about Iran or the people in Iran. You're just using that as a cynical ploy to shut up criticism of a government that you like. Second point, effect. What effect is a bunch of Western leftists going to have on the Iranian government? I'll tell you, jack shit. It's not going to have any impact. We have potential impact over our government. And that's kind of how I feel like in the current moment. I'm just really worried that there might be champagne bottles popping in Langley because there's a brewing internet fight over, is China a morally correct government or not?
Yeah. Well, I guess.
Can I just make one point in that? Sorry, very quickly. One, I would never consider Syria to be a civil war. And if you're talking about the drought that drove many of the agricultural workers and so on into the suburbs, which then made them fertile ground for the radicalization, the drought was very much engineered by Turkey, that has control of water supply into Syria and Iraq. So I think we have to be also careful of labeling something climate change when very often it's actually being engineered to create the conditions in which that environment can flourish. So just because I looked into that to a huge degree, and there are papers also confirming that Turkey played a very big role in that. If you look at the last 15 years, how many times they cut off the water to Hasaka in the northeast and deprived 2 million people there of water supply. So it's very easy for Turkey to do because they have control of all of the dams for all the water supply into Syria and into Iraq.
Yeah, fair point. I'm not sufficiently aware of that. I guess all I would say is that adds to the problem with the ecological crisis, is that if you have nature producing stresses, you can also have governments accentuating those stresses, a la Ethiopia, India, Tibet, Pakistan, etc.
Karim?
Yeah.
Or Fee?
Sorry, Fiorella, you want to say something?
No, you go ahead because I have a lot to respond. So you can go ahead and talk first.
There's so many things Peter touched on, and so many things in my mind that I wanted to respond to. I think in many ways I agree with Peter. I think the kinds of considerations you described when it comes to China are pretty much spot on. And I think it also aligns with what Vanessa and Fiorella have been saying also about Russia, is that they're very pragmatic. And in this world system, being pragmatic is not being anti-imperialist. That's number one. And I think that was also a little bit why we were talking about this. I think many of us, and were me too, as somebody who really likes China, I was very incensed by this idea of a counterpole in this multipolar world. And I was following all these commentators, also very, very intellectually interesting commentators up to now, who also often said this, like, the rise of China, U.S. imperialism goes down, U.S. destroys, China builds, and indeed China builds a lot. But when it comes to this kind of pragmatism, and that it's a similar kind of foreign policy, you say, as in the past, that there has not been much of a change, is pretty much says that okay, China is pragmatic, just like Russia, just like many other sub-imperialist nations, meaning that that also China or Russia do not have a problem using Palestinians, for example, as a pawn in world affairs. And I think the problem right now is, even though we can say, yeah, but why are we discussing these moral issues? Morality is just, we can focus on that, but that is not at play now in these terrible things that are happening now with climate change and wars coming up and droughts and everything and nuclear doom. Yeah, but in the meantime, the Palestinians are disappearing. In the meantime, Palestinians are being tortured and raped in prison camps. So I still really, really care about that morality, and I'm not going to let that go, because that is the only thing that keeps me alive, hoping on a better world. Is that kind of humane human morality that I feel, and that I also that gives me that expectation that I have for nations that I have hope in, such as China. Like that morality drives me to be frustrated that a country like China, which I see as morally above the West, not doing anything as such a major power to stop what is happening to the Palestinians. Call me an idealist, call me a fantasizer, but that is something I was hoping on, and I was expecting, especially after following all these channels about China's rise, that it's so good for the world. And I wanted also to jump into what you just said, Vanessa. I agree. It's not just that we focus only on Russia or China. I'm deeply disappointed by Algeria. I mean, I'm a Dutch man of half Algerian descent, and if there is one thing that gave me pride about the Algerian part of me, is the fact that it's not only won an anti-colonial battle against the French, but also that it has been consistently anti-colonial in world affairs. So what just happened now is just baffling to me, absolutely baffling, and it disgusts me deeply. And so, in other words, it disgusts me regardless of who it is. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I wanted to say one more thing before I also go on too long, and that is about that whole that racialization of help when it comes to international help. That people, and again, like you said, Vanessa, that many of these hallelujah channels will say, oh, this is an Arab problem. What you're doing right there when you say, oh, this is an Arab problem, or this is this problem or that problem, is you fall for the divide and conquer tactics of imperialism. Why do you think they carve up nations? Why do you think they carve up nations by ethnic group? So that one ethnic group says that ethnic group's issues is not my problem. Why do you think suddenly Algerians and let's say Egyptians have all these problems together, while back in the day they were all part of the Arab Empire? Because they carved everything up during colonial times, and suddenly they're different nation states. Gaddafi said the same thing, and they started to fight each other. Oh, I don't need to help my neighbor because he is not us. And it's the same when you're Chinese or you're Russian and you say that's an Arab problem. Okay, then the racialization of the world and the carving up of the world has worked, because the divide and conquer technique of the imperialists has worked, because you are right now saying we do not need solidarity against the powerful in this world because we are of a different race or we are of a different ethnicity. Not we're all human, part of a human family. We're in a class war. We have to get rid of all these billionaires and these capitalist monsters. No, because I only need to fight my own capitalists and screw those people because they're black or they're Arabs. I think that is. Yeah. I think that is such a big deal, a big problem, because you're not. I think one of the central features of the battle that we are in currently in the world. We also had a guest on. His name is Professor Walden Bello from Asia, and he also said here in Asia, among the BRICS nations, we also need the workers. Professor Walden Bello also said we need here in Asia, we need as a workers also to push our elites into a progressive direction, because if we don't, they will be captured by capitalism just as in the West, because we're all human beings. And I think that's the final point I would like to make, is that people often think that imperialism and anti-imperialism is a question of nations, is a question of wars between good countries and bad countries. You have the good anti-imperialist countries and the bad imperialist countries. But I think what we increasingly see in this world is not that we are in a war between nations. We're in a war between classes. It doesn't matter where you're from. top classes are cooperating. They are cooperating, and the only way to get rid of this hellscape that we are in, and Professor Gerald Horne also says it often on our channel, is that we need an international class struggle. And I think what we saw at the UN, what we see happening in Palestine, just proves that point.
Mm.
Yeah, I agree exactly with that. And, again, so my counter argument to pretty much everything Peter said is the fact that, yes, I understand the United States, Israel, Europe, UK, Five Eyes, let's even say, are the problem, especially the United States and Israel, the driving force, NATO, all that have caused the problems around the world. That doesn't mean I cannot point out when, especially nations that have been bestowed this moral superiority by many people, are not acting in a moral way. It's not even just in a moral way. It's the fact that others have bestowed that upon them. A lot of people have made Russia to be the Soviet Union when it's not, and they still treat it as such, and it hasn't been for a long time. And as somebody that lives there, I can tell you firsthand, it is an extremely capitalist nation. It is absolutely driven by self-interest. The government is very much driven by, yes, diplomacy, but economic expansion first and foremost. And there are various points of views that of whether people are content with that, and some people are not content with that. Some people talk nostalgically about the Soviet Union and how things were before and how they were better and all of these things. It's not just what you get. And unfortunately, in the independent media sector, you only get, NATO is great and Russia and Putin are terrible. Putin is Hitler. He wants to take over the world. Or you get, Russia is the absolute best thing ever and everybody can go there and it's like gumdrops and ponies and rainbows and everything is just perfect. And so I reject these 2 points of view because they're not representative of reality. The reality is much more somewhere in the middle. And that's the same I would think of with China based on the research I've done, based on what I've seen. And when actions do not follow your rhetoric, which I think like the rhetoric in China, I will stand by that cop-out term. I'm sure Peter will watch this later. I'll stand by that cop-out term because I think that term really kind of exemplifies in a very modern way what it is that the policy of these powerful nations has become when they somehow cannot cut off any economic ties to Israel. Tomorrow, China could stop trading with Israel and it would be fine. It would absolutely be fine. As Peter pointed out, China is embedded in everybody's economy, right? So what's the difference then? Why don't they do it? Why don't they just stop trading with Israel? Mm-hmm. And the thing is, why am I focused on that? Well, because I know the United States isn't going to do it. I know the UK isn't going to punish Israel. I know that those are beyond hope. Those are the powers that are beyond hope in terms of asking them to do something. They're not going to do it. But if we are to believe that there is an ideological anti-imperialist drive coming from China or coming from Russia, if we are to believe that they are opposing hegemony, then I'm going to demand it from them, or at the very least say, if you are saying in your rhetoric that you support international law, that you support the plight of Palestinians, if you're saying it's been decades that you support this, then show me. I don't care about your rhetoric because I'm sick of rhetoric. I hear it all the time from dumb politicians in the United States that continue to trick people into believing in electoralism. I don't need to hear other politicians in other countries talk to me about rhetoric when what we're seeing here is very cutthroat pragmatism that has sold out Palestinians and will continue to sell out Palestinians. Because if powerful nations who have the ability to oppose and stand toe-to-toe with the West, which is weakened, don't act differently, don't change the conduct of how this entire world is operating in a very capitalist-driven, greedy, globally just ambitious, but in a way that is disregarding human life, if they don't oppose that, then what is the difference of a China, U.S., Russia-led world instead of just a U.S. Western-led world? It doesn't really matter to me if you have, 5 rich billionaires at the table versus 2. Like, they're still working in cohesion for themselves and for that class. And that's ultimately what I've concluded. The left, and I come from the left, so I'm frustrated with a lot of that sentiment, because it's like, oh, we can't criticize like China or Russia because it's it's our fault. Like it's like, yeah, I get it, but that doesn't mean I'm gonna let it slide. Okay, I'm not gonna let it slide. I'm not gonna like clutch my pearls because somehow everything they do is gonna be looked on with a lens of perfection. That is no longer true. The material conditions, which they love to talk about material conditions, the material conditions of right now have changed the world to the point where we're not operating under these ideological, they're not operating under these ideological assumptions of what happened with Mao or what happened with Lenin and Stalin. All of that, it happened. And all of that was destroyed by the interventionism in the Soviet Union of the United States, and I would say diluting of all of that. And when it comes to China, they have said that they're a communist country, but they engage so well with using capitalism. I'm sorry, it's outright capitalism and global capitalism at that. And what I'm seeing is just we're going in that direction where nation states aren't mattering anymore, where the ideologies that they even have don't even matter anymore. It's about a multinational, international class of elites against the rest of us. And that has become more clear after Palestine, because who's not going to get a seat at BRICS? It's not going to be Palestine, the Palestinian people. If you recognize Palestine eventually and you put the PA there in charge, there's no Palestine. That's not Palestinian people. That's ridiculous. That's not it. You don't have Venezuela. Venezuela's not allowed to be there. You don't have nations that have been suffering under empire. What you have are the powerful ones that have enough money, enough capital, and enough influence to be there. So ultimately, whose interests will be at the forefront? And that's kind of my whole thing. It's like, I'm just sick of like the whole like, oh, but this is China and Russia are allies. Well, show me that they're allies, because they haven't been. And this is like someone that does not hate on Russia or China, does not buy into the NATO lies, but I also am not buying into a lot of the excuses that are made while the actions show otherwise. China is still continuing trade. Russia is still continuing trade. The relationships are there. There's a lot of things they're getting out of this. I don't believe for a second, I'm not going to be naive enough to think that it was just the issue of international law and sovereignty. What is really driving them, I think, is economic expansion, and that's as cutthroat as that is. That's how they operate.
And protectionism, because their relations with the Gulf states, and even now again with Syria, Russia is expanding into Syria with Israel's help. China is clearly being given an open door back into Syria to some degree, economically, and through investment and so on. So it's also protectionism. And where I find this sort of incredibly sad, this is the second time that they've betrayed the sovereignty of Palestine, because both the Republic of China and the USSR voted for the partitioning of Palestine back in 1947-48. Stalin went as far as to supply weapons and pilot training and planes to the terrorist Zionist forces back then to defeat the Arab armies, until he finally realized it was a mistake, because Israel was never going to be a socialist outpost for Russia in the Middle East. It had been designed as a British and then US military bulwark in the Middle East against pan-Arabism, against Arab socialism and independence, right? So they betrayed their own principles again back then, perhaps mistakenly, but now they're making the same mistake again. Except, of course, we know that it's not the Soviet Union, but still they're making the same mistake again, and they're betraying Palestine again. And that's what I find incredibly depressing, is this 100 years of history of Palestine slowly being disappeared by some of the most, as Karim said, some of the most satanic, demonic forces in the world today. And Russia and China as two of the P5 who have the power. They had the power to stop this bill, this resolution going through, and they reneged on it. They effectively gave a green light.
And not only if I can jump in for a short moment, not only the same mistake then, let's not forget that they abstained in a 2011 UN resolution as well and destroyed Libya. Let US imperialism completely destroy Libya.
And Yemen, Yemen both also.
And Yemen,
Yemen.
You would think that they would have learned their lesson by now, but like Peter also explained, if you're a pragmatist, you don't have that moral problem. And if you would have learned from that, and you would have that moral problem, then today you would say, no, we're not going to abstain. We remember what happened in Libya, for example. But the same thing is happening again. It's just being a handout, handing over the Palestinians to their brutalizers.
Exactly. And to what extent have China, sorry, Fee, 1 second. Have China and Russia benefited also from the destruction of Libya? Because both of them now are embedded in all these countries that have been effectively destroyed and devolved from any kind of economic independence or even resource independence. And that includes Sudan and China and Russia's role there, which can only be described as destructive, certainly not constructive. When China is arming both the SAF and the RSF, the RSF, of course, through the UAE, but still the UAE is supplying Chinese advanced weapons to the RSF, which is now a genocidal entity in Sudan. What I'm struggling with is, yes, of course, all of us can accept that they're pragmatic, they're working under realpolitik, they're protectionist of their own interests and their own assets in whatever region we're talking about. But effectively, what that ends up meaning is that they're fused into the imperialist system. And until they unplug from that imperialist system that they're fusing deeper and deeper into, I don't see any hope at the kind of oligarchy, billionaire class level of us being saved in any way, shape, or form. So I disagree also with Peter in this. Why are we looking to some kind of alliance between, I don't know, China, Russia, the EU, and so on to change the world? The change has to come from us, doesn't it? Just as Yemen has done, for example, that Iran did under the Islamic Revolution, that the non-state actors, resistance actors are doing. They're creating their own subsystem, which is not actually a subsystem. It's a morally much higher system than the one that they're being forced to live under. And isn't that what we should be looking at doing? Is creating subsystems in which we can thrive as the human beings we want to be and in a world that we want to live in, even if it's separated to some degree from this increasingly top of the food chain transnational oligarchical system, which Issa Bloomy actually described it really well yesterday. He said it's like a cartel. They'll compete over certain aspects of power and status, interests, investments, and so on. But ultimately, where they overlap, they'll come together to create the environment in which they can all flourish. I don't really want to live in that world. whoever is in charge of it, whether it's so-called multipolar or whether it's, the current unipolar paradigm, I don't want to live in that. I want to live in a world where we have free choice, where we can actually choose the system we create among ourselves, however small or large those communities are, where we can thrive, as I said, in an environment that we can actually continue to be human and have these moral reactions to what is going on around us. I don't feel I don't feel that I should kind of criticize myself for having moral values, because isn't that what we have to live by ultimately?
Yes, I fully agree. I fully agree. That's why I like to talk to both of you, because I think that's missing a lot. And I think a lot of people have been psychologically conditioned into the imperialist capitalist system to actually almost ridicule if you expect moral judgment or a moral stance of certain countries, nations, group of people, because that's not the way things work. Yeah, well, if you cling on to your humanity, that is the way things work, or should work, in my opinion. And I just, like you say, Vanessa, I just don't want to live like that. That I accept that as normal. And I also think that if we do not critique the alternatives, if we do not critique Russia, if we do not critique the global south, if we do not critique China, then what we are doing is we can already predict for the future that we are rebuilding the same thing. We are literally, if we don't critique the alternative, we are reproducing the same thing. And that is a bit of the thing that I also think that is a bit of a problem when you see that celebration of the new multipolar world, and you cannot say anything about Putin or Russia. Oh man, that is so sensitive, that stuff. And then I'm thinking, like, this is just MAGA. That's MAGA of the other side, and these people would literally be the nationalists. Once these countries would be in power, you would have the same nationalists. You know what I mean? We need some serious self-reflection when it comes to that stuff on the left and on the anti-imperialist side. Even if you don't want to call yourself left, if you just want to call yourself anti-imperialist, I think we really need some critical reflection on that point. What do you actually want? Do you want a different, better world, anti-capitalist, and a more humane world, or do you just want your team to win? You know what I mean?
I think a lot of these people just want their team to win. I mean, I think that's what it comes down to. I think it's just they've created in a fantasy world where they put certain countries, certain people, certain ideologies on a pedestal, and they won't deviate from that, because then their entire world collapses, because all of their identities are built upon this one thing. And when you build your identity upon, only relying on the idea of it, well, yeah, that's another matter. And when you build your identity upon this stuff, then you can't deviate from it. You're too far into it, and you don't even know what you believe in at that point, because it's been dependent on what your team, what this so-called sector that you've put yourself in. And so for me, yes, I mean, obviously I come from an anti-imperialist left perspective, but at the same time, what does that mean in the United States when a lot of these people who call themselves anti-imperialist left are justifying this decision? This lack of veto. They're justifying the abstention. They're saying disgusting things like it's just an Arab problem. They're saying this is how it always is there. It's not on China or Russia. This is not our responsibility. They're morally just completely, shifting into a world, like both of you said, that I don't really want to live in. A world that is devoid of any humanity, essentially. And what we have seen in the last few years since this genocide is the fact that I can even say it's ongoing for 2 years, is to me has shaken up the perspective of so many things. And it didn't just begin with that. I mean, there was also the fall of Syria. There's also been a lot of events in the last, say, 5 years that have shifted my perspective in terms of what where I think we're going. And ultimately, when I see things, you know, as we're gearing up towards wrapping this up here, when I see things like the whole Russia thing, when I see the Russian peace plan now being thrusted in the forefront, when I see that Kirill Dmitriev, who is, you know, Putin's envoy, the same way Stephen Witkoff is Trump's, are having like these conversations outright, have devised this 28-point plan, which, by the way, has all of the economic aspects that look like they belong to Kirill Dmitriev. And then after that, it was confirmed that him and Witkoff actually drafted out this plan with Rubio there. And you know, and here's the thing, like, you see this desire for cooperation, for normalization coming from Russia with the United States. You see that, and yet people are still arguing to me that Russia is going to somehow take on Western hegemony. First of all, I haven't expected that, like, for a long time. Second of all, you're not looking at the actions of what they're doing. You're looking at what you wish to happen. And these trips on hopium really get us nowhere, because at the end of the day, we really have to look at reality in order to advance. And the reality is quite dark. It's quite depressing. But at the same time, it's kind of like we have to face that in order to figure it out for ourselves. And I agree, like with Vanessa, that we need to really figure out how to save ourselves, because it's so much right now that's out in media, whether it's independent, mainstream, whatever, requires us looking at heroes to save us. And the reality is there are no heroes. You know, we are the heroes. I mean, the heroes are people that are not known as heroes. The heroes are just people that do things every day. And the thing is, I think people have been just brainwashed to look to politicians as heroes, when in order to be a politician, basically at that level, you have to pretty much be like some sort of maniac at this point, because the world is at that level. And it's very few that are capable of maintaining any sort of moral compass. And if we're going to pew morality and just toss it aside, then what's the point of living? Because if we have no morality, let's just go out and kill each other and do whatever we want and live in a society where we don't care about anybody or anything. It's like, what world are we living in? If it's like morality, how dare you discuss morality? Like, of course we're going to discuss morality, because you have these morons, politicians in the West, talking about democracy every 2 seconds, and then you have the entire UNSC talking about international law. What international law? You're allowing people to get killed, and you can do something about it, and you're not doing it. So what you can pontificate from your podium about international law, but what international law are we allowing these people that are getting slaughtered? Like, it's a farce. It's like watching a really bad script of a movie and just saying, is this even, like, what is going on here? Who thought about this? This is terrible. And that's kind of how I feel every day, like, that everything is just terrible. And people really need to look at the things that are happening before them. Russia's not hiding it, and I've said this before. China's not hiding their relations with Israel, with the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. They have these relationships with the new regime in Syria. They're not hiding it. It's all out there. We're not saying anything that is made up. What we are saying is people aren't talking about these things. That's it. So look at that. So look at how Kirill Dmitriev is going on and on about Trump and about this deal, and how they're so excited. Trump today said, this morning now for us, said that some advances have been made. He's looking forward to it. There's been a revision to make Ukraine look, be a little bit happier, make Zelensky cry a little bit less, whatever the case is. We know that this back and forth, they have decided there's mining, there are minerals, there are deals to be made in the Arctic, in the Donbass. There's a lot of money going forward to this next revolution, which is in fourth industrial revolution, which is literally all about AI, all about the tech. And that is also where we're going to next, and what is going to impact the people as increasingly we are surveilled more, as our movements, our words, everything we say is surveilled more. And I don't think, unfortunately, I think a lot of the left has failed to look at this, the technocratic aspects of where we're headed, that have a lot to do with what they want to happen to Gaza and Palestine, and how they want to make that an example of what they will impose on the rest of the world. And if we allow that to happen, well, everybody is a target. We are all next. And I think we will all suffer because we have allowed that just complete monstrosity to happen. And while we're chastising about international law and a new world, like built on the bones and the devastation of people who really didn't deserve any of it at all. So
and actually also, I just want to add the eradication of the history of these people, because that's what they're also doing. You know, all of these countries that are now looking at investment in the countries that have been destroyed by the imperialist West. But what has actually happened, and that is also deliberate, in Syria, they're destroying a lot of the ancient monuments. They've destroyed it throughout the regime change war. But now they're changing even the commemorative days of former martyrs against imperialism and so on. In the Gulf states, they've been writing the history of Palestine and the Israeli Nakba and occupation out of the education curriculum, right? So that's also what we're looking at. We're going to even lose, just as we have in the Americas, lost the history and the culture and the civilization of the indigenous peoples, or in Australia, or, New Zealand, anywhere in the world where this has already happened. That's happening here also. And it's happened from 1917 onwards, where Palestinian historians, authors, writers, journalists were deported first, so that they can't record what is going on. So, everything, our global heritage, our global history is going to be taken away from us. The entire slate is going to be wiped clean for us with the destruction of Palestine, the extermination of Palestinians, the extermination of Lebanese resistance, the breakdown of Syria, Libya, Iraq, Yemen. The reason that these conflicts now are being amplified in the Horn of Africa is because it's going to target Yemen eventually. Because what's happening now, all these outlying resistant states and non-state actors are going to be slowly contained and eradicated. That's the plan. Doesn't mean that it's going to be successful. But if it is successful, people have no idea of the wealth of culture they're going to lose in that process. And again, that's not a world I want to live in. I don't want to live in a world that is just nothing but modernity, which is another point that's always sold on the back of Chinese policy in particular, right? Great to some degree, but I don't want the planet to be covered in solar panels. Or, you know what I mean? Like, we have to fight to actually protect our environment. As Peter actually said, but it's up to us as individuals, because the ruling powers don't care. They don't care about the people. So are they going to care about the environment? Rare earth mineral mining and processing is destroying the environment. To do what? To give us flat screen TVs, mobile phones, apps, everything that's going to be a major part of the surveillance tyranny that's coming in. So we have to make a conscious choice to actually say no to all of this, from a moral perspective, from a human perspective, from a historical perspective, because we're losing everything that makes living on this planet as wonderful as it should be. We are losing it. We've already lost a huge amount. If I look back, 20, 30 years, we've already lost so much.
Yeah, and let's not forget that in the meantime, what all the things that are happening on the ground, when you think about your cheering on countries and this, that, I think what people often don't realize is you were just talking, Fiorella, about how that minister of Russia is meeting up with Lavrov. With what's this guy's
Witkoff.
name?
Witkoff.
Witkoff. With Witkoff, and don't forget, at the time that they are drinking wine and making deals, the girls and boys are killing each other on the ground of Ukraine.
Yeah.
Eh? It's if people if you really think about it. I mean, you remember that moment that Putin was meeting up with Trump, and Putin came out of the plane and did this to Trump, and Trump was waiting there. These guys are sitting together, having a coffee, probably drinking a wine and making deals, and maybe have a disagreements or not. At that same time, thousands of boys and girls are murdering each other and raping each other because those two are having disagreements. You know what I mean? And one final point I wanted to make about like being a moral person, or we are all conditioned in that social media world into that kind of oppositional thinking. Oh, it's an area problem, or you celebrate this country versus that country. We are either conditioned into that system, and you become this kind of realpolitik thinker. You think that morality is ridiculous, that isn't the way the world works, or what's happening? Sorry, there's a lots of noises over here, but so you on the one hand, people ridicule that. You say, why do you guys care about morality? That's not the way the world works. And then this is they are pragmatic. Russia is pragmatic. China is pragmatic, and you cannot expect this. But in a way, you're imprisoned already. Then mentally imprisoned into that imperialist system. You're not free anymore. You're free when you believe that we can have a humane world. You can be a moral human being. And for example, that brings me to the people in Yemen. These are really, really free people. They have a morality. They sacrifice their life for their morality, for their Palestinian brothers and sisters, and they keep going while they are super poor. And it's no coincidence that they are the ones who are always starting with to the free peoples of the world when they do their speech. They always start to the free people of the world. And it's true, they are the free people of the world. They follow their humanity. And we all in the West celebrating this leader and that leader and this imperialist bloc and that imperialist bloc. We're not free. You know what I mean?
Definitely.
That's a good way to end it there with that thought process to the free people of the world, because there are very few people who are free and follow their convictions and put their rhetoric into action. They also put their rhetoric into action. They live by this code, but they actually act on it. They don't just say it. And it's very rare to find people who have the integrity to do that, especially in media. Let's be honest, it's one of the most places where I've learned, in media, that is unfortunately people are very much operating in that same type of just whatever I can gain aspect. And this is why, we try to bring a little bit of the aspect of we're trying to operate as close to the truth and as close to some sort of humanity as we can. So, Karim, thank you, and Peter for coming on and having this chat with us. And everybody should follow their Substack, BettBeat Media, and take a look at a lot of the things they write, because it's very profound and it's great, and it's a different perspective too than most of what I see that's on media. Vanessa, anything else you want to say?
No, not at all. I think the point about Yemen is very important. They fear God more than they fear anything that human beings can do to them. And whether you believe in God or not, their moral code is what we should all honestly look up to, because it is setting the example for the world.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me on. And we're going to invite you guys soon on again.
Great.
Sounds good. All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time on Critical Perspectives. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.